I used to think our marriage worked because it was quiet, because nothing ever really exploded, because the house in Ashbrook felt orderly and safe and adult in the way I once believed adulthood was supposed to feel. But that October night rewired something in my head in a way I still can't fully undo. Jessica and I had been married 3 years, together for 5, long enough that routines replaced spontaneity without either of us formally acknowledging it. And our bedtime routine had become one of those unspoken scripts you don't realize you're following until you miss a line. We brushed our teeth, checked our phones, turned off the lights, and lay down on our respective sides of the bed like pieces placed back into a familiar puzzle. I reached for her the way I always did, slowly, carefully, not even hopeful so much as dutiful, and she said, "Not tonight," in that soft, neutral voice that had become her default. I was already preparing myself for the usual feelings, the mild sting, the quiet disappointment I'd learned to swallow and bury under rationalizations about stress and long days, and tomorrow being another chance. But then I looked at her face in the dim light and saw something that stopped me cold. She exhaled, just slightly, and her shoulders loosened, and there was relief there, unmistakable and unguarded, like someone setting down a heavy bag they'd been carrying longer than they wanted to admit. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't guilt, it wasn't even irritation, it was peace, and that realization hit harder than any argument we'd never had. In that instant I understood that saying no to me wasn't a compromise for her anymore. It was her comfort zone, the outcome she hoped for rather than avoided, and the worst part was how long it had taken me to see it. I lay there staring at the ceiling while she rolled over and fell asleep almost immediately, her breathing evening out in a way that made it clear she felt safe and settled, and my mind started replaying the past year with a new, brutal clarity. I thought about how often I'd been the one initiating, how rarely she had, how I'd stopped flirting during the day because it never seemed to lead anywhere, how physical closeness had slowly been reduced to practical touches and polite hugs. I realized I'd been negotiating my own needs down in my head, telling myself that this was just what long-term relationships looked like, that wanting more was immature or demanding, and that patience was the same thing as understanding lying there in the dark. I finally admitted that what hurt wasn't the rejection itself, but the fact that she seemed genuinely more comfortable without me reaching for her at all. As if my desire had become another small stressor she was relieved to avoid. I didn't confront her that night, or the next morning, or even the week after, because the truth had settled in quietly and deeply, and I needed time to sit with it, to accept that the distance I felt wasn't imagined and wasn't temporary. That moment didn't end our marriage, but it ended my denial. And once you notice the relief on someone's face when they turn away from you, it becomes impossible to pretend that everything is fine just because nothing is loudly broken. What unsettled me most was realizing that the shift hadn't been sudden or dramatic, but slow enough that I had adapted to it without noticing. Like living in a house where the temperature drops 1 degree at a time until you're freezing and can't remember when you were last warm. In the beginning, Jessica was affectionate in ways that felt effortless and natural, touching my arm when she laughed, leaning into me on the couch, reaching for my hand in public without thinking about it, and intimacy felt like an extension of that closeness rather than something separate we had a plan for. Over time, though, that ease eroded, and physical affection started to feel conditional, as if it required the right circumstances, the right mood, the absence of stress, and the reassurance that nothing else more important needed her attention. Sex went from frequent to occasional to rare, but what stayed with me wasn't the declining number. It was how mechanical it became when it did happen, like something penciled into a calendar rather than sparked by desire. The excuses changed too, becoming more polished and clinical, framed in terms of migraines, deadlines, early meetings, and being touched out, explanations that were reasonable on the surface and hard to argue with without feeling selfish. I told myself I was being mature by accepting them, that pressuring her would only make things worse. But quietly I noticed how the rejection no longer came with softness. There was no pulling me closer afterward, no compensating affection, no whispered reassurance that she still wanted me even if she didn't want sex, and that absence hurt more than I was willing to admit. She stopped holding my hand during walks, stopped resting her head on my shoulder while we watched TV, stopped absent-mindedly tracing circles on my chest, and each small withdrawal felt insignificant on its own, easy to excuse as her being tired or distracted, yet together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. When I reached for her, she didn't just say no, she subtly pulled away, creating space between us that lingered long after the moment passed, and I learned to interpret her body language before her words, bracing myself before I even tried. I began to feel like intimacy had become a transaction with unspoken terms and conditions, something that required me to be patient enough, helpful enough, unobtrusive enough to maybe hear a yes, and that dynamic made me feel less like a partner and more like someone asking for a favor. What scared me most was how normal it all seemed on the outside, how we still functioned as a competent, responsible couple, managing schedules, sharing chores, and making polite conversation, while the emotional and physical closeness that once defined us quietly slipped away. The distance between us wasn't marked by arguments or anger, but by a calm, polite detachment that masqueraded as maturity. And it took me a long time to understand that what we were calling stability was really just the absence of friction, not the presence of connection. After that night, I decided to stop without announcing it, not as a punishment and not as a test I planned to reveal later, but as a quiet experiment I needed for my own sanity. I stopped reaching for her in bed, stopped letting my hand linger when we passed each other in the hallway, stopped initiating hugs, kisses, or those small hopeful gestures that used to come naturally to me, even after years of rejection. I shifted into something that felt safer, colder, and strangely easier, treating our marriage like a shared living arrangement rather than a romantic bond, and I told myself I was just matching her energy instead of constantly offering more than she wanted. I was polite, friendly, and emotionally restrained, careful not to cross any invisible lines, and I expected the change to at least register, maybe create an awkward silence or a confused moment where she asked what was wrong. Instead, the opposite happened. Within days, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way I couldn't ignore. Jessica seemed lighter, more relaxed, as if some background tension had finally been removed. She laughed more easily, not the tired, polite laugh she used with me lately, but genuine bursts of laughter at her phone or while talking about her day. She started planning girls' nights again, staying out later without checking in as much, chatting freely over breakfast instead of moving through the morning like she was bracing for something. I noticed her humming while brushing her teeth, a small detail that shouldn't have mattered, but hit me harder than any sharp word ever could. That sound made it clear she wasn't missing anything, wasn't confused by my withdrawal, wasn't wondering why I no longer touched her. She was thriving in the space I created. The absence of my affection didn't leave a void for her. It gave her room to breathe. Watching that unfold was brutal in a quiet, isolating way, because there was nothing to argue against, nothing to confront, no villain to point to. I felt like I had erased myself from the equation and discovered that my presence had been a source of pressure she was relieved to be free from. She didn't ask why I no longer cuddled her on the couch, didn't comment when I rolled away at night instead of toward her, didn't seem to notice that I'd emotionally retreated behind a careful politeness. The more I pulled back, the more at ease she appeared, and that realization hurt in a way I still struggle to articulate. It was worse than rejection because it wasn't personal or emotional. It was structural, like discovering that a piece you thought was essential had quietly become unnecessary living in that house, sharing meals and small talk while watching her joy bloom in the absence of my desire. Forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding for a long time. We weren't drifting anymore, and we weren't stuck in a temporary rough patch. The connection I had been trying to protect had already dissolved, and all I had done was finally stop pretending it was still there. When she finally acknowledged the change, it wasn't with concern or confusion, but with a kind of calm satisfaction that made my stomach sink. One evening, as we sat across from each other eating dinner in that quiet, orderly house, Jessica smiled at me and said she was proud of how much I'd grown, how I no longer seemed driven by physical needs, how I finally understood what really mattered. She framed my withdrawal as maturity, as if I had evolved past something childish and needy, and the way she said it made it clear she believed this was a success story. To her, my lack of desire wasn't a warning sign or a loss. It was proof that our marriage had entered a healthier phase, one defined by stability and calm rather than expectation. She talked about how nice it felt to live without pressure, without the constant undercurrent of obligation, and she seemed genuinely content, describing our relationship as a partnership built on companionship and peace. When I tried to probe gently, asking whether she was truly happy now, she didn't hesitate for even a second. She said yes with an ease that left no room for doubt, explaining that this dynamic was exactly what she wanted, a marriage where nothing was demanded of her physically, where affection wasn't assumed, where love existed quietly and without friction. Listening to her, I realized her definition of intimacy had shifted so completely that my silence felt like alignment rather than absence. She believed we had arrived at some enlightened version of marriage, one stripped of drama and desire, and she looked at me like a partner who had finally caught up to her understanding. I nodded along, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know how to explain that what she called growth felt like grief to me. Inside, I was mourning something that had died slowly and without ceremony, a version of us that had once included warmth, longing, and mutual want. From the outside, we probably looked better than ever, Two calm adults sharing a home without conflict, communicating politely, respecting boundaries, and giving each other space. Friends would have called it healthy, balanced, mature. But in private, I felt hollow, like I was inhabiting a carefully maintained shell of a marriage that no longer had a pulse. Her peace came from the absence of my needs, and my discomfort came from realizing those needs no longer had a place to exist while she settled into this new definition of happiness. I was quietly saying goodbye to the marriage I thought we were building, trapped in a life that appeared perfect on the surface, but felt empty every time I sat alone with the truth I wasn't allowed to name. The confirmation didn't arrive in a dramatic moment or a single cruel sentence. It revealed itself through a series of small, increasingly impossible to ignore exclusions that made it clear I was no longer considered an essential part of her life. Jessica began making plans without mentioning them to me until they were already set, casually informing me she'd be gone for the weekend with friends, or that she decided to visit her sister without asking if I wanted to come. Decisions about finances, schedules, even holidays were framed as statements rather than conversations, and when I hesitated or asked questions, she looked mildly confused, as if my input was optional at best. The ease with which she moved through life without factoring me in was unsettling, and it became obvious that our marriage no longer functioned as a partnership, but as a shared space where our lives happened to overlap. What hurt most was how comfortable she seemed in this arrangement, how natural it felt to her to operate independently while still benefiting from the stability of having me there. I overheard her on the phone with a friend one afternoon, laughing as she described how I'd finally grown out of my clingy phase, how refreshing it was not to deal with a husband who constantly needed reassurance or physical closeness. She said it like a compliment, like something to be proud of, and I realized she had fully reframed my withdrawal as self-improvement rather than quiet desperation. My pain had been repackaged as progress, my silence interpreted as enlightenment. The final moment of clarity came during an ordinary dinner, the kind of unremarkable evening that somehow carries the most weight in hindsight. She smiled at me over her plate and thanked me for not being like other husbands, for not expecting physical connection, for being so easy to live with. She said it warmly, sincerely, as if she were expressing gratitude for a gift I had willingly given her. Sitting there, listening to her praise the absence of something that once defined our bond, I understood the truth I'd been circling for months. She didn't want a husband in the way I understood the word. She wanted a peaceful coexistence, a companion who shared expenses, responsibilities, and space without ever reaching for her hand or asking for more. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her safe constant, her emotional furniture, someone who made life easier by asking nothing at all. That realization settled heavily in my chest, not as anger, but as a deep, unmistakable sadness, because it meant the marriage I was still trying to mourn had already been replaced by something she considered ideal from that point on. There was no confusion left, only the quiet understanding that I was living with someone who had found happiness in my absence. While I was still standing right in front of her, once the truth settled in, with a kind of calm finality, the decision to leave stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling inevitable, like acknowledging gravity after pretending you could float. I didn't rage, I didn't threaten, and I didn't try to extract one last explanation from her, because by then every answer I needed had already been given in 100 smaller ways. I planned quietly, methodically, with the same restraint that had defined the last months of our marriage, waiting for an evening when she was out with her book club, something she'd started attending more frequently now that our lives barely intersected. When the house was empty, I moved through it slowly, not sentimental but deliberate, packing only what was essential: clothes, documents, my laptop, things that were unquestionably mine, leaving behind everything that tied me to the version of us she believed still existed. There was no dramatic pause, no second-guessing, just a steady awareness that staying would mean erasing myself further. Before I left the bedroom, I placed my wedding band beside her jewelry box, not as a message or a plea, but as a clean ending, a symbol returned to where it belonged. I walked out without locking the door behind me and drove away in silence, feeling strangely clear rather than relieved. My phone started buzzing before I even reached the highway, her name lighting up the screen again and again, calls shifting from confusion and anger to something closer to panic as the night went on. But I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish her, but because there was nothing left to explain. Silence felt more honest than another conversation she would reinterpret. Over the following weeks, the calls turned into messages, then into accusations, then into pleas that framed my departure as something sudden and inexplicable, as if I had vanished without warning. She showed up at my workplace one afternoon demanding answers, telling anyone who would listen that I'd left out of nowhere, that everything had been fine, and I watched her struggle to reconcile the story she'd been telling herself with the reality standing in front of her. I didn't argue or defend myself, because the narrative no longer mattered. The divorce paperwork came soon after, formal and impersonal, a bureaucratic conclusion to something that had ended long before either of us acknowledged it. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty or impulse. It was the quiet reclaiming of a self that had slowly disappeared. And for the first time in a long while, the silence I chose felt like my own court stripped away any remaining illusion that we had simply drifted apart quietly, because Jessica arrived with a version of events that cast me as volatile, immature, and suddenly demanding, someone who destabilized an otherwise peaceful marriage by wanting too much too late. She spoke with confidence, insisting everything had been fine until I changed, until I became fixated on physical affection and ruined something stable by refusing to be satisfied with companionship. Listening to her describe our marriage as healthy right up until my exit felt surreal, like watching someone describe a house as intact while standing in the rubble. When it was my lawyer's turn, the tone shifted, not through theatrics but through a careful reconstruction of patterns I had lived inside for years. He laid out timelines, messages, and testimonies that showed how intimacy hadn't abruptly vanished, but had been consciously abandoned and reframed by Jessica long before I left. How she had openly celebrated the absence of physical connection and labeled my withdrawal as growth rather than pain. The court heard how her idea of marriage had evolved into something platonic by design, not by accident, and how that vision left no room for my need for affection without branding it as immaturity. For the first time, the disconnect was named plainly. We were not broken in the same way. We were incompatible at a fundamental level. I didn't want excess or novelty or validation. I wanted closeness, and she wanted peace that came from not being touched at all. Even after the divorce was finalized, the story she told others never changed. She told friends I had abandoned her over shallow reasons, that I was obsessed with physicality, that I threw away something good because I couldn't evolve past basic desires. I watched from a distance as she preserved that narrative, because correcting it no longer felt necessary. What stayed with me was not anger, but a quiet sadness at how completely she misunderstood what had been lost. She never saw the absence she celebrated as a death, never recognized that what she called pressure was my attempt to stay connected, never realized that a marriage without affection wasn't neutral. It was empty for one of the people inside it by the time the truth surfaced in a room where it actually mattered. It was already too late to change anything, and I understood that some people don't recognize loss until the silence they wanted becomes permanent. Time did what no argument or explanation ever could. It gave me distance enough to see the marriage clearly without the ache blurring its edges. And in that space, I found something I had almost forgotten was possible. Years later, I met Emma, and from the beginning there was no need to negotiate desire or downplay affection, because she understood intimacy as connection rather than obligation. She wanted to be wanted in the same way I did, not as validation, but as a shared language, and the ease of that mutual understanding felt almost unreal at first. With her, touch wasn't a request that needed the right conditions. It was a natural extension of closeness, and being kissed or held didn't carry tension or relief, only warmth. I remembered what it felt like to be desired instead of merely accommodated, to be met rather than managed, and that realization healed parts of me I hadn't realized were still bruised. Loving her didn't feel loud or chaotic. It felt grounded and alive, full of quiet moments that reinforced rather than erased my presence. Meanwhile, from a distance I became aware of how Jessica was spending her time, drifting through online spaces and echo chambers where she framed her past as survival and her solitude as empowerment, ranting about toxic expectations and shallow men who wanted too much. She never acknowledged the irony that she had once been with someone who gave her exactly what she asked for, someone who removed pressure, stopped reaching, stopped asking, and eventually disappeared without a fight. In her version of events, I was a cautionary tale, not a loss, and she clung to that narrative because accepting the truth would have meant confronting her own role in the emptiness she now inhabited. I didn't feel vindicated by that knowledge, only quietly resolved, because moving on had never been about proving her wrong. It was about finding a life where affection wasn't something to apologize for, where peace didn't require self-erasure, and where love was expressed openly instead of negotiated away. In the end, she got the world she said she wanted, one without pressure, without expectation, without someone reaching for her hand, and I found something different, a partnership where connection and peace existed together. The contrast didn't feel like victory or revenge. It felt like closure, The understanding that sometimes two people don't fail each other so much as choose futures that cannot coexist, and that walking away can be the most honest act of love you ever offer yourself.